Okay, we are live.
Right, we are reconvening our afternoon meeting and have invited Emily Carollo back, with Cougar Research Collaborative, to introduce us to the idea of a feasibility study, what it means, and share what the next step might be if we're interested.
Great. Thank you so much, representatives, for having me today. I really appreciate it. So today I am going to cover more explicitly what a feasibility assessment would entail. So it's very still generalized in the sense of feasibility assessments are state specific in a sense, which I'll dive into a little bit further, but it'll give you a better idea of kind of what they mean and what they would potentially cover. As I know I mentioned them towards the end of my conversation or my presentation last time, so hopefully this gives you guys a little bit more of an elaboration. So before we jumped into it, since it's been a second and there may be some folks who are tuning in that missed the last presentation, I just want to cover a couple recap slides so we're all on the same page. I work for a nonprofit called Panthera, but I work with a group called the Cougar Research Collaborative. So who explicitly is the Cougar Research Collaborative? It's three conservation nonprofits: Panthera, Tompkins Conservation, and Northeast Wilderness Trust. And there's also three university researchers, two of which are from the Ohio State University, and one of which is from Michigan Technological University. This group was formed very late 2021, early 2022 to investigate the possibility of cougars returning to the east by asking some initial questions about habitat and social support. So who am I? I am a wildlife biologist for a little over 10 years now. My experience has mostly been in black bears specifically, especially for the last 5 years or so. I was the Pennsylvania Game Commission's black bear program manager for the last 3.5 years. I love being outdoors as much as I humanly can. I hunt, I hike, I run, I bike whenever I get the opportunity to. Last summer was actually the first time I ever hiked in Vermont, and it was quite beautiful. So I do have quite a bit of experience with wildlife, particularly predator species, and have a little bit of that state agency background. So get the opportunity to bring some different worlds together and understand some of the issues and concerns that either nonprofits, NGOs, and wildlife management agencies make face. So particularly when it comes to the Northeast, reintroductions, while it may seem crazy to think about a cougar restoration in the area, restoration is not anything new. All of these species have been either reintroduced entirely or reinforced population-wise in the Northeast. Some of them are very iconic success stories when it comes to restoration, particularly animals like bald eagles or river otters. And even when that state I last worked in, elk were reintroduced back in the early 20th century. And there's a thriving population there now. So when we talk about restoration efforts, it actually is nothing new. State wildlife agencies have recognized the importance of bringing back species that were extirpated. For many of these species, it was very similar to what cougars experienced here, or catamounts in the state of Vermont. And essentially, state wildlife agencies took up the opportunity to say, hey, these species are gone. Let's take the opportunity to try and bring them back. And for the most part, have been extremely successful in doing so. Cougars were found throughout North America. They are still found throughout the vast majority of South America, but when colonization occurred, we began to see things like overharvest, persecution, and habitat loss, which affected, again, not only catamounts, but many other species. And so eventually the entire eastern United States and a good chunk of the western United States lost their cougar populations. And now the only eastern current population is in Southwest Florida. That is the Florida panther. They are state and federally endangered. Those years are like the rough estimates of when last cougar sightings were believed to have occurred in the Northeast, and that image kind of in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. So there are cougar populations still in the United States or in North America in general, but they're pretty much entirely found out west. Like I said, the only eastern population is the Florida panther. And again, why are they gone? Habitat loss, overharvest, and persecution. So we'll jump in the feasibility assessment. First, I wanted to cover important considerations when thinking about a feasibility assessment, to talk about some of these other categories that are often covered in these feasibility studies or assessments. First and foremost, what even is feasibility? It's the possibility that something can be made, done, achieved, or is reasonable. Now, when we're talking about a feasibility assessment, a feasibility study, especially when we're talking about a restoration project, this is viewed through a lens of set objectives. So it's not just, can we bring cougars back? That's a very, very, very broad question. And this is what I was talking about earlier by saying this becomes a little bit more specific. So objectives are identified by state wildlife agencies, by stakeholders, by the public as to what is reasonable in the state of Vermont. So for example, is there a concern about funding for state wildlife agencies and how that management would move forward and what it would look like moving forward? That objective could be set to say, we only have X amount of dollars and X amount of personnel time to be able to manage a species like cougars. And so that objective is set to, or maybe there's a concern about agricultural conflict and livestock conflict. Is there a limitation that the agricultural community identifies that would be unreasonable and not allow for this feasibility? So we're setting objectives that are important to Vermonters and important to the managers that would eventually manage these species. Preferably, state wildlife agencies would be a leadership role because they are the ones that are most in tune with what's going on in the state when it comes to wildlife populations. They have the managers and the researchers that are knowledgeable about these wildlife species and what their populations look like, how they're distributed on the landscape, what current management concerns that they have. And again, this doesn't necessarily mean that a state wildlife agency is doing every single detail of the work. There's definitely the possibility for collaboration, as I mentioned last time. For example, you see the in the screen there a picture of the assessment for elk release in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation has done a significant amount of work with state wildlife agencies to actually even fund feasibility assessments for the restoration of elk within their states. So it doesn't necessarily have to be entirely on a state wildlife agency, but the importance of state wildlife agency leadership is preferable. Feasibility assessments do take time. It is a lot of reading, it is a lot of reviewing literature, it is a lot of communication, and there may be a couple smaller studies to assess certain or address certain concerns that may come up. So for example, there may be a public opinion survey sent out. Typically, those don't take too terribly long to do. It might take at least 6 months, 8 months to be able to collect all the information and then be able to get some sort of inference out of that information. So about 1 to 2 years is generally a decent timeline for a feasibility assessment. And then lastly, the establishment of a working group may be necessary. And what I mean by a working group is typically what you see in something like wildlife management plans. You bring together representatives from important stakeholder groups that help provide input as to what considerations should be made. So that would actually be very helpful when thinking about setting these objectives through which feasibility is identified through. So one of the first sections that will probably be covered is just the history of cougars, or I should say catamounts, in Vermont. So what this would be helpful for is that it would collect any historic information about catamounts in Vermont. It would look at distribution. Was there any management when colonization occurred, or was it just simply, persecution over harvest? What kind of ecology might be mentioned? Now you may be thinking like, where are we going to get this information? Occasionally, you can find actually some interesting information from journals, from colonists that came by, or really historic archive documents. And especially in northeastern states, there tends to be, or there can be access to some of these archived materials that may not be, a history of cougars in Vermont or catamounts in Vermont, but it may be someone who traveled around the state of Vermont, has some of that inference of what wildlife populations they had noticed and what kind of behavior that they documented. So this is helpful because you get some information about what catamounts looked like and what their populations looked like historically. And this also, most importantly, helps address why cougars are gone. So it more explicitly defines how those processes happened and occurred. And then also make sure that these reasons have been addressed for extirpation. Because if the extirpation reasons are not addressed, what's the point of bringing these animals back if they're just going to be gone as soon as they hit the ground? One of the largest sections would be ecological feasibility. Now, this would be a very large and diverse section. So one of the first things that you would want to cover is life history and ecology of catamounts. Who are we even talking about? What's their reproductive cycles? What kind of survival are we looking at different age groups, and males versus females, dispersers versus non-dispersers? What kind of mortality do they tend to face? I mean, the list goes on. You would want all of that basic information about catamounts, or cougars as we call them out west, in this feasibility assessment so everyone knows who we're talking about, what average size of them, what average home range do they have. You'd also want to discuss habitat needs. So in general, cougars are considered a general species. I mean, they live all the way from the boreal forests of Canada all the way down into Central America, where we get more of those tropical environments. There's cougars in more desert ecosystems like Mojave Desert in California. So they are a general species when it comes to habitat. They can live in a lot of places, but in general, what kind of things do they prefer? Every species has some level of preference for habitat or things that they desire to be able to do the activities they need to do. So looking at current literature, speaking with current cougar managers to better understand how catamounts would potentially use the landscape and what considerations would need to be made. And this may even include some level of physical assessment. So my colleague in Pennsylvania actually had American marten managers come to the environments that they had identified through modeling in Pennsylvania to assess what they thought was potential marten habitat. And they were able to say, yeah, actually, this habitat is very good. The model did a good job in predicting what habitat may be available for this species. It would cover diet, which is going to be a huge component of that, especially because I recognize the deer hunting community and the hunting community, that is going to be a significant concern. And that's fair. Hunting is still a very important and culturally iconic practice. I totally understand that. And so diet would cover a lot of that to understand what cougars are currently eating in their ecosystems and how that may be applied to species here in the state of Vermont, which then leads into this interspecific species interactions. How do cougars interact with other species? And this could broadly be broken down into two categories: species of greatest conservation need, SGCN species, or game species. And so they both have animal species that are important to Vermonters and for a variety of reasons. And so we would try and identify places where cougars may overlap with similar species. So for example, there's a lot of places where cougars overlap with animals like moose, with animals like lynx, and you could potentially infer how those interactions may play out here in the east, where they currently are in the west, and at least have some level of inference, some level of information. And game species would be the same. And then lastly, there would be genetic considerations. I think it's important, it's actually very important, this particular point, because if a population of cougars were to reestablish in the east, particularly the northeast, their nearest populations are thousands of miles away. Cougars exist in a landscape of metapopulation dynamics. And essentially what that means is that they have, these like hubs of populations, and the way that they all stay connected are through dispersers. And that helps disperse different genetic material, different genetic variation to keep genetic diversity high. If you actually look at the Florida panther population, they've had issues in the past with low genetic diversity, and that can lead to birth defects, that can lead to reproductive concerns. And so long story short, it would be very important to think about what level of genetic diversity would we need if a population were to come back? How do you maintain that higher level of genetic diversity? And what does that mean in the long run? So just things to consider genetically when it comes to population management. So the next section would be social and economic considerations, right? There are a lot of very important economy or economic markets here in the state of Vermont. Very true. And so some of the things that you would want to start to consider would be things like public opinion. How does the public feel about catamounts returning? We have done a little bit of that work. It's been at, again, pretty coarse scale, and it's be very helpful to get a much more fine scale information or survey done to better understand that kind of opinion or thoughts about it, and maybe try and break down, are there groups that are more supportive or less supportive? And I think it's always very important to remember that not every group is a monolith. Not every group of people all believe the same thing, if that tends to be the belief. And so that's, for example, what I always like to say is, just because hunters really enjoy deer hunting, it doesn't necessarily mean they wouldn't enjoy seeing animals be restored. And we found that in some of our research as well, our public our surveys that we've done. There would also be a large amount of stakeholder group engagement. Again, this kind of goes back to when typically larger plans are written by state wildlife agencies, they tend to bring in stakeholder groups that would be affected in some way, shape, or form. Now, granted, with such a wide ranging species, there would probably be a lot of stakeholder groups involved. I'm thinking the Vermont Farm Bureau, any tourism bureaus or agencies that exist, hunting communities, conservation groups, etc., that would be taken into the process and engaged to better understand either what their concerns are or if they're supportive, why they're supportive, and how to be able to implement those considerations in or address those considerations into the feasibility assessment. It would also address things like state agency needs. What kind of funding may they need? What kind of personnel or time considerations do they have? What does the future look like for wildlife funding as a whole? Is that something that should be thought about before this action happens, or maybe while this action happens, to grow relevancy for the state wildlife agency? Long story short, state agency needs would also be addressed in something like a feasibility assessment. It would address things like human cougar conflict. This is a huge component of the social considerations that would be made. Human cougar conflict and wildlife conflict in general is nothing new to managers anywhere, but it would be important to identify what types of conflict occur in the current cougar range out west, and particularly how much that applies if they were to come back east, and what kind of preventative methods could potentially be implemented to help prevent those conflict concerns. And then lastly, these recreational activities, considering how people are using the landscape currently, what kind of impact that may have either to a returning catamount population and or vice versa, a returning catamount population to the recreational activities that many Vermonters enjoy. And I just wanted to point out that if you wanted to know who the American martin guy was in Pennsylvania, he's the one standing next to me in the cornfield. We were dove hunting, so that was a little fun trip. So there would also be a section considering legal implications. Now, I am not a lawyer, I will openly admit that, but there always is this legal consideration and implications of animals coming back. And some of it seems it might be not what you may think when you think about legal considerations. Explicitly thinking about species classification and what that classification means in real time. So for example, we know that catamounts are state endangered here in the state of Vermont. What does that mean for catamounts being restored? I don't explicitly know that. I'm not going to take any, stabs at it, but are there considerations to be made for land use concerns? Or would it be better to have this animal listed as maybe a game species with a non-harvest season in the meantime? I mean, basically, what kind of classification will be beneficial to this animal returning and also to the idea of feasibility? And then just some other things to think about, like I mentioned, land management, recognizing that the vast majority of the Northeast is privately owned. How would we help landowners adjust to cougars potentially being on their property? Or the idea of creating, now you wouldn't have to do this immediately, but it would be important to consider things like creating a response plan for human cougar conflict and thinking about what kind of legal considerations may need to be made in that situation. So now we're getting towards the end of the plan. We've covered these really kind of broad topics of ecology, social, economic considerations, legal considerations, and we're thinking about what would a restoration effort actually look like. Now, this wouldn't be a deep dive. This wouldn't necessarily be, we know exactly where we're going to get the cougars from and when they're going to come here, et cetera. That's more of a reintroduction plan if it got to that point, but it would start to consider some things like what kind of, again, wildlife management personnel and funds we would need to manage species. Is there going to be NGO involvement? What kind of NGOs would be involved? How would they be involved? It would think about potential source cougar populations. Where would we want to get cats from? It probably would make more sense to get cats from a place where there's a spring, summer, winter, and fall, and not just constant desert temperatures. That's not to say that cougars aren't highly adaptable, and again, a generalist species, but just starting to think about what these source populations may look like and starting to make contact with these managers, which hopefully those relationships would already be built because you're looking to also find information. So it's not just saying, would you think about being a source population? It's also saying, we just really want to learn and incorporate whatever information you have into our feasibility assessment. It would look at collaborating with regional and state wildlife researchers, particularly at universities, starting to build those relationships, which many state wildlife agencies already successfully have, particularly if you're looking at USGS cooperative units in many different states. They help state wildlife agencies do a lot of this wildlife research already. And so building that alliance, building those relationships. So researchers would be identified to help with post-monitoring research, et cetera. Would also be important to look at the history of prior state wildlife restoration efforts and identifying other large wildcat translocation efforts. And the reason why I say that broadly is because technically cougars have never been reintroduced anywhere to establish a new population. However, in some states, cougars have been translocated, so moved away from their original home range and moved far enough to weigh in hopes that they would reestablish a home range elsewhere and away from whatever these folks, state managers at the time were moving them from. So if you think about, for example, California, they have a bighorn sheep population that is particularly endangered. When they have a cougar specifying on those sheep in particular, and they're concerned about over predation, they will actually move some of those cougars. They've started moving them away to establish new home ranges elsewhere away from that sheep population. And so trying to find that information, which actively Panthera actually is doing, we're collecting that particularly state-led cougar translocations within state, but there have been restoration programs for large wildcat species around the world: cheetahs, leopards, tigers, lions. Actually, my supervisor is working on several right now, particularly with lions in Gabon in Africa. And so trying to essentially learn from these specific cat translocation efforts, and then also other, even though it may not be cats, but other wildlife restoration efforts in the state that may be helpful to learn from. What things happened? How did it go? What kind of mistakes were made? What kind of things went really well that we should implement in other restoration efforts? Now, this may seem a little odd, but basically one of the other sections that would be important to consider is this idea of why. Why are we even considering bringing cougars back? And the reason why I say this is because it not only addresses some of these topics that may be less spelled out, less discussed in some of these earlier sections, but it also helps identify why we're even considering writing this feasibility assessment in the first place, right? And so sometimes the reasons or things that may support feasibility may be less tangible than just literature and are important to consider. So for example, I always think about this cultural aspect of catamounts in Vermont being a catamount state. It's not really like in the literature, maybe in historical context, but it is important to consider that maybe that may be a reason that supports or maybe doesn't support feasibility. So this video is actually from a project in the Tetons that my supervisor did, or one of my supervisors was doing. So very last thing, the very last section would be recommendations for next steps. Now, this is important because it doesn't matter if feasibility is found or is not found. We need to decide what the next steps are. And so this is kind of like the management implications of a feasibility assessment. All the information was gathered, it was written up in a report, and there is basically this report to help managers make a decision of what the next move would be. So say feasibility is found. Great. Well, what does that mean? Are we going to take some time because we identified also that the public could use some education efforts? Or is the next step a reinstruction plan? Or feasibility is not found, right? What are the reasons for not finding feasibility? Is it worth the time to try and address those concerns? Or is it just something so far off that the reality is it's going to be a long time before we could actually consider the possibility of catamounts returning? And so really this information is just important. It wraps up the text. It says, okay, we have all this information. This is the report, and this is what our decision will be moving forward. So with that, try to keep it short and sweet. You're going to take questions. Thank you so much.
Members have questions? I guess, well, okay, I'll start I guess I'm curious, other states have done feasibility studies, or is anyone else entertaining this idea right now?
For cougar specifically? No, not that we're aware of. We have spoken to other states, but they have not explicitly said that they would do any sort of feasibility assessment.
Thanks, Representative Bartholomew.
I was wondering about when you have rare, endangered, threatened status, is that federal or state or both?
So for the eastern cougar, they're
I'm
listed.
talking about general, not just cougars, but any species.
So do you mean like, does it translate to, like, if it's state listed, does it translate to federal? Sorry, I'm
Well,
just not
is it
understanding the
just a
question.
federal designation or do we have state designations as well? In the
Yes.
different states.
Yeah, so there's state designations and then there's federal designations, and sometimes species like Florida panther are state and federally listed, or lynx is another good one. 'Cause
So
they're
I
state
guess where I'm
endangered and
going
federally.
with that is if you have a population of, say, cougars in the west, they're not endangered, they're populations that are steady. And we move them here, are they then endangered here but not there, or how does that thing work?
Yeah, so I mean, technically, right now, cougars are listed as state endangered in Vermont. So if they were moved here tomorrow, they would be state endangered in
One showed
Vermont.
up, yeah.
Yeah, or one showed
So
up.
that's a state designation now,
Mhm. And that could
I see.
arguably
Okay.
be changed
Yeah.
moving forward.
but it's not just a federal designation, it's state and federal.
Yeah,
Okay.
there are both.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Do you have a question?
So they're not federally listed then?
Cougars.
Right,
Right,
right.
I mean, just,
right.
Species
Okay, I thought
in
you were
general.
saying- Yeah.
yeah, right, got it.
How much would a feasibility study cost?
I think it really depends on a couple of things. A, what level of research needs to be done? So that can be probably one of the most large costs when it comes to feasibility assessments. And then it would be a personnel cost. So it really all depends on who necessarily writes it. If you needed to add a new position, it would be those position costs to explicitly do that. If the responsibility was on a current wildlife manager, I mean, I guess it technically wouldn't cost anything extra because position's already paid for, but also that person probably has responsibilities already for wildlife species here. And when it comes to the research side of it, to give you an idea, I would assume there would be some level of social or public surveys continued throughout a feasibility assessment that the state of Vermont would want to do. And they can range anywhere from, a little over $10,000, $20,000, all the way up to $60,000, $70,000. It really just all depends on to what degree you want to do. But I do think it's important also to recognize that this is where NGOs could be potentially very helpful and that they can help support these kinds of research needs, which again is nothing new when it comes to trying to figure out what wildlife management needs states have.
And also,
Can you do incremental, like you do a little bit of study and say it's looking good or it's not looking good for this to happen?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think some of these things are fairly tied together at times. So I think it would be better if you were going to do the feasibility assessment that you would just do the whole thing to
Mhm.
get like the best picture. And again, if once these objectives are kind of identified, that might take honestly the longest part because you're incorporating the public's opinion, you're incorporating stakeholder opinion to try and build these objectives, similar to what management plans do when they set goals, right, for populations of what kind of population management do they want, what kind of human conflict, wildlife conflict they want response-wise, where you bring in a group of stakeholders and you get their opinions on what they think that wording should be, et cetera. That might actually take a little while. But I think once you've got that, a lot of it is literature review. A lot of it is communicating with current researchers and managers. And I think you'd be better off answering the whole thing. But you know what? That's also not to say that that's impossible. You know what I'm saying? I've never seen it done that way. And typically these feasibility assessments do take a little while. So I don't see why it would be impossible. But you also want to keep the information up to date, right? So that's the other thing is if you do it in little parts,
Mhm.
and then you start to find like what I did 5 years ago isn't really applicable anymore. So it's a good question though, and I don't think I have a very direct answer.
So would you help us? Who would develop the objectives? Who would be responsible?
So that would probably be best led by the State Wildlife Agency. And again, that's not to say that the Cougar Research Collaborative couldn't be a collaborating partner in some way, shape, or form. But that would be best led by the State Wildlife Agency, who also has kind of that insider knowledge about certain wildlife populations in the state.
Mhm.
other questions, Representative Chapin?
Thanks for going through that in great detail. It's really helpful. I guess I'm just thinking, my knowledge of this kind of feasibility in this kind of reintroduction is more in the western states with top predator species. And you started off the very beginning of this presentation saying it really should be at the state level. And I'm just sitting here thinking, you know, does Vermont even have, like, isn't there just like a high level of feasibility? Like, does Vermont even have a reasonable amount of good habitat for a healthy genetics in and of ourselves? And I guess I just really wonder, I'm sort of surprised to hear the focus on like a state plan and a state feasibility and our wildlife folks really taking a lead, when to me it's, I would think this would be more of a regional approach, would work best in the Northeast, given the size of our states in the Northeast and how likely cougars would be moving to the Adirondacks and Vermont and Quebec and Maine. And so I'm just sort of thinking of, I guess I'm just wondering if, given the size of our states, you know, maybe some of this big game reintroduction isn't really appropriate at the state level. But if you could maybe speak to that a little bit more, and specifically, if you think that there is enough regional, you know, where there's a lot of discussion about these wildlife corridors, including Quebec, across the Northeast, the Northern Forest, but, you know, region, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with that bioregion, but I guess I'm wondering why you're leading with such a state-specific conversation, and I'm curious if maybe a more of a regional approach could, I know that requires a lot more coordination with a lot more parties, but I'm curious about that.
Yeah, so first and foremost, you're totally right. Wildlife doesn't listen to political boundaries. So the reality is that animals would be moving across state lines. There's no doubt about that. We are working, and to some degree, as a regional approach, but we are approaching each state individually, right? So ultimately, I think there's two things to this. Is yes, there is regional collaboration. It has to be there. There's no doubt about that. But ultimately, you know, state wildlife officials in Vermont are managing wildlife for Vermonters. I also think that taking this step forward for any state and saying we're interested in actually investigating this may lead to other states following as well. Coming from a former background as a wildlife manager, I understand the constraints within a state wildlife agency, and they can be real tough, right? It's bureaucracy. I totally get it. And so that's why we've really made a significant effort to communicate with multiple different Northeast states who I have heard, and even from my colleagues and who are also friends, they will openly say, like, as a biologist, I think this is awesome. I think this is a great idea. As a manager, it's a little scary because you're kind of put in a different role, right? Trying to keep everybody happy. So you're totally correct. There is an opportunity to work regionally, but we do also have to think about that state-specific level, because we have to engage specifically states, right? Like, we have to specifically engage state wildlife agencies because they're the ones doing this. If we think about also a regional level at a higher level of government, like federal government, the federal listing for cougars in the east doesn't really help because they're listed as extinct. So technically the responsibility kind of falls more on state wildlife agencies for regionally extirpated species like that. And then also, you know, I'm not sure how much success we have at this point with something like cougars returning on a federal level, having that federal level of collaboration with the current administration.
And how about with Quebec? What's the conversation like with Quebec?
So I've reached out to the biologist in Quebec. I haven't heard back from, I believe it's her. I have spoken to the biologist in Ontario, and he was super stoked about it. I mean, he didn't say that Ontario was thinking about, and we arguably haven't done much work in Canada. But he was like, yeah, I'd be happy to collaborate, I'd be happy to communicate, you know, work with states if animals cross lines, that kind of deal. So we have reached out though to Quebec, and again, just haven't heard back from them.
So I guess I'm just sort of curious about like given the way you described the feasibility study, I almost wonder if there's like a pre-feasibility project we could take on based at the state level to expand the conversation and engage people more deeply in a region. I just wonder if there's maybe a pre-feasibility step here.
Yeah, so I mean, we have done some work as far as state level engagement and social surveys, and we have found support for cougar restoration actually in every state from West Virginia up. if I'm being perfectly honest, which it increases as you go further northeast. So, as far as this regional coordination thing, absolutely imperative, right? At the same time, I think that it really depends on if we're looking at it from a standpoint of we're looking to get every single state to agree to reintroduce cougars, or we're doing it at a state level and collaborating with those states if cougars cross state lines. And historically, you know, if we're looking, for example, if you're looking at like the Martin restoration in Pennsylvania, that again, it didn't happen. So I'll make sure I'll put that on record. It didn't end up going through, but what that biologist did is there was a habitat identified very close to the New York border. What they said, or what they did, is they communicated early on, like, hey, by the way, this is potentially really good habitat to reintroduce martin. Would you be okay if they cross the state line? And that collaboration was created early on. And, you know, from my understanding, New York was like, yeah, they crossed the border there. That's fine.
It's an interesting point, but I think that going, you know, first is the trial balloon, and then see what other states are interested or what their concerns are as it unfolds. Representative Bartholomew.
Staying the theme of collaboration, if there were populations established in Vermont and New York, someone put this lake between them, would those populations eventually find a way to communicate, or how would that, or would they just be totally genetically isolated?
They probably would be, there would have transients back and forth between the populations. I mean, there's also, what is it, 87 that runs right through that eastern portion of New York as well. And actually, I would argue the water is less of a barrier than the highway itself. But we do still see in western states populations that have individuals go between pretty
Do they
vast
swim?
swaths of non-habitat. Yeah. They swim.
Yeah. I saw lynx cross.
I mean, it's some level of an impediment, right? But
Yeah.
it's
I'm
not.
just curious how genetically isolated they would be with a body of water like that.
And we are working, you know, it would actually be very helpful, instead of just having one population, to your point of collaboration, it would be very beneficial to have more than one population reestablished in the region to help with that genetic diversity component, because they would only be 100 miles apart maybe instead of thousands of miles. And so having two populations reestablished, even if it's in two entirely different states, would actually be very helpful. And that's why we've communicated with pretty much all of the Northeast states. We're still working on having some of these meetings with the State Wildlife Agency personnel and some other states as well. But to put forward the results and ask, are you interested in doing something like feasibility assessment?
I guess I just kind of envision an easier cooperation between thinking about cougars in the Adirondacks and Vermont than trying to go other directions.
Representative Tagliavia.
With the Florida Panthers, how much human contact have you seen or conflict in the state of Florida with the Panthers?
You mean directly with humans or things like livestock? Directly with humans?
Actually, both.
Yeah, you know, to be honest, I don't have the exact numbers as far as like, particularly for livestock, that's going to be more frequent than, say, far frequent than humans. Matter of fact, if I'm remembering correctly, I think in the last like century, there's been, I want to say there's been less than 30, it might have been less than 25 people who have actually been killed by cougars in the last century. So obviously any wild animal can be dangerous. It doesn't matter if they have sharp teeth and claws or they're hooved and horned. They can all be dangerous. And that recognition is very important to think about. And when I discussed that section of the why before, it's important to recognize the why nots as well. A lot of it, actually, one of the main reasons we get is real, what we call real and perceived threats. So the real events that actually happen, and that is typically a very small amount of actual conflict, and then the perceived threats. And I say it typically when I talked about human black bear conflict, I always said, like, a lot of folks, they see a black bear and they're like, hide your kids, hide your wives, like, it's coming for me. But it's still very important to think about from a human dimensions perspective. There was a 2015 report from so maybe outside of Florida, less specific. There was a 2015 USDA report that documented, I think it was like 2 or 3% of all cattle loss was due to wildlife, or maybe it was 4%, I can't remember. Very low amount. The rest of it was like weather events, disease, etc. And of that 2%, 4%, it was like 2% of that was due to cougars. And now, mind you, there were cougar livestock mortalities reported in states like Mississippi, which we know more than likely is not true. So the ability to prevent human carnivore livestock, livestock carnivore conflict is very possible. Also a serious consideration. I know there is a huge agricultural community in Vermont, a very important one. And that's why they would need to be invited to the table to express concerns or whatever they may have. I can find more specific information on those numbers though, because they do exist. I just don't know them right off the top of my head. But I don't think anybody in Florida has ever been killed by a Florida panther.
Thank you. Further questions? I don't have any, but I do see that Roz Renfrew's with us. Welcome. Glad to see you here. It seems like, it would be important for us to hear from the department at some point soon. I'm not putting you on the spot now. But it would be of great interest, I think, to the committee to hear from you all. I'd be happy to oblige. Right. All right, Representative Chapin.
Just on the last question about any interaction you've had with UVM in terms of interest in existing research and existing expertise.
Yeah, so we have had contact with UVM. We also have a collaborator at Middlebury College. We're actually looking to host an event that would bring together wildlife managers and regional researchers and tribal nations within the region to explicitly discuss this idea of cougar restoration in the region, and with the notion that there are no preordained answers. Obviously our group would love to see cougars come back. I don't think there's any way of denying that. But on the same token, we understand there are legitimate concerns. And so being able to bring folks together in an academic, science-driven environment to voice those concerns, discuss them, think about what they mean in the long run when it comes to feasibility, not just in the state of Vermont, but all around in the region, would be incredibly helpful. And even bringing in current cougar managers to help discuss some of this as well. And so we're looking to host that at the University of Vermont, actually, because of some of the collaborators that we have. Thanks.
So hoping also to hear from the rest of your team and get the broader picture from them.
Right.
So maybe you can help us schedule that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I apologize. These guys, I swear it's like wrangling cats. Or cougars. Catamounts.
But briefly remind the committee who they are and what information they'll bring us.
Right. So you know what? It might just be easier for me to go back a couple slides so I can make sure I mention everybody. Ooh, sorry, guys. Slide. Here we go. So from Panthera, the organization that I work for, we have Mark Elbrock. He is our Puma program director. He has been with Panthera for, I think, over a decade now. He is world renowned for the work that he's done with cougars, but also a community called Cyber Tracker, which is a group that teaches folks how to track wildlife and wildlife sign in the woods. Currently, he lives out in Washington State. He manages the Puma team that has projects going on in the Olympic Peninsula, where he lives in Washington, and also in Torres del Paine in the Patagonia area of Chile. And so he has a lot of experience both doing the research and conservation side of things with pumas, but also working with legislators and state wildlife agencies to help create either legislation or policy around cougar management. So some of the recent things he's assisted with was Washington State recently updated their harvest strategy for cougars and helped kind of implement some of the science that made sense to allow for a sustainable harvest. And also in the state of Texas, actually cougars were considered category of varmint. I don't know how else to put it. And so they were allowed to be killed in any way, no season, no bag, there were no protections, nothing. And so he helped Texas get together the support to create just really basic regulation around cougar harvest. So he's has some experience with state wildlife agencies as well. Axel Mohenschlager is my supervisor. He's a conservation, translocation, and small cats program directors for Panthera. Axel is also the IUCN chair of the conservation translocation group. And basically he has helped work on conservation translocations like restorations of species all around the world, from plants to beetles to small mammals to, large mammals, birds, reptiles. And so he brings a lot of background to the table when it comes to conservation translocations. And like I said, he's explicitly working on several conservation translocation programs right now with Panthera, including African lions in Gabon, Arabian leopards in Saudi Arabia with the Arabian royal government. And then Renat, I always butcher her last name, Brackersmith. She is our North American director. So she helps manage a lot of the components for the North American programs of Panthera. She helps us make sure that we stay in touch with all of our funders. We do our reporting and really kind of helps organize a lot of the different projects that are going on and the funding and really the organizational side of things for us. Vanessa Castle is actually fairly new. She was recently hired by the Puma program to be the cultural conservation science coordinator. She is part of the Lower Elwha Qualam tribe in the Olympic Peninsula in Washington. So she has helped us reach out to some of the tribes in the Eastern United States who at times can be forgotten and included into some of these wildlife management considerations. And so she's helping us build those relationships. Then you have me. And then with Tompkins Conservation, we have Sawyer Downey, who is a representative for Chris Tompkins and with Tompkins Conservation. They do a lot of conservation and research work all around the world. Particularly, they are doing a rewilding project in, my gosh, it's not Chile. I'm completely forgetting the country they're doing a lot of work in right now, but it's in South America. And they actually purchased land, and it wasn't just missing jaguars, it was missing everything. And so they actually were able to restore a whole bunch of species, including prey species first, and then large predator species like jaguars. And so they've done some really cool work there in South America. Tom Butler is with Tompkins Conservation and Northeast Wilderness Trust as well. He lives in the state of Vermont. He is a longtime Vermonter. He's corrected me countless times to say catamount and not cougar. That is my background. And so he has been a part of the Northeast Wilderness Trust for a while now, and is also on the board for Tompkins Conservation. So that's why he's listed in both spots. Shelby Perry is an ecologist for Northeast Wilderness Trust. She's also from the region as well. She does a lot of work for Northeast Wilderness Trust and forest management, ecosystem management for the properties that they own. And then our university researchers are Jeremy Bruscotter. He is a social scientist, particularly for the human dimensions of wildlife. And he has done a lot of work with state wildlife agencies to survey the public, better understand the opinions and thoughts and all kinds of management decisions that they are interested in. He actually recently was helping Ohio investigate the social support for returning elk to the state. So, I mean, that's just one example of how it all connects. And then Ben Ghassemi, he is a postdoc at Ohio State, and he is helping analyze a lot of the social survey and science data that we have, and to help publish this literature, be able to get it out for folks to, take in and read. And so Ben brings in a background of working with a lot of social science analysis and research, particularly with large carnivores. So he's worked with bears and wolves and cougars in that social science setting. And then John Pasutich with Michigan Technological University. He's a social scientist and a wildlife population biologist. So he has done a lot of work with wolves in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and kind of in the Great Lakes region, both research on, the population dynamics of those species, but also the social science behind it, the social support for that species.
And just briefly, you told us about their work as best you could last time, but just remind the committee kind of broadly what they've each done, those researchers, to help gain information about this reintroduction in the Northeast.
Like the research that we've done, or okay. So we have published, I believe it's around 4 papers now, or maybe 5. So there was a publication regarding the natural recolonization rates of cougars heading eastward, and how quickly it would take for cougars to recolonize eastern former ranges. And that was done by Tom Glass and other researchers. There is work from Veronica Jovovich that identified habitat patches or contiguous patches of habitat in the eastern US. It went beyond the Northeast, it's in the Midwest and the Southeast, right? So wherever there was contiguous habitat in the former eastern range of cougars, and particularly identifying patches that were large enough that could support a genetically diverse population of cougars, recognizing that, again, some of this property, or some, I should say property, some of the habitat in the east can be broken up by various things like urban centers, agricultural, centers, etc. There was work by Connor O'Malley. He did habitat assessments, but looked at it from a continuous kind of variable setting. So basically what he did is he created a map that looked at how cougars were using the landscape in their western range from 20 different study areas from Canada all the way down to the Southwest, how they use the landscape, what they preferred, and then mapped it out to the entirety of North America, including in the eastern range. And so what his map designates that's different than Veronica Jovovich's work is that it's the entirety of habitat available. It doesn't identify those habitat patches like Veronica Jovovich's work does. And there was a paper also published by Shelby Carlson. She was with the CRC earlier on when some of the social science work was, or survey work was being collected, the data was being collected. And she published work on some of the questions that were asked in that survey that were more general and less specific about cougars returning themselves. So explicitly, what do you feel are priorities for, and I'm like paraphrasing this question, so don't take me literally, but what do you feel are high priorities for state wildlife agencies? And so she published a paper that kind of discussed some of those things. And I'm probably forgetting, but yeah, there's been some other work as well.
And I just want to remind members that Emily was here before with us, and I just looked up she's in there twice because her name is spelled differently, so we should put that together, but
There's a lot of double R's.
but you also brought a lot of information for us to follow up on at your previous presentation.
Great. And I'm always happy if there are questions that you feel may be more particular to some of these groups or some of these members in our group. I'm happy to send you along to those folks. They're all great.
Great. Well, I think it would be helpful for us to, get the high level on that. Essentially, there's been a lot of horse data collection that is applicable to Vermont. So in some ways, the pre-feasibility has already occurred, and I just wanted to bring that back to the attention of members because we've covered a lot of territory since we last heard from you. We've been thinking a lot about other topics than cougar reintroduction.
Totally get it.
Thanks again for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you. Appreciate the time.
Any last questions? See any?
Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.
Members, tomorrow morning we are on for some bill introductions at 9, and then we have Michael O'Grady joining us at 10 and again at 11. See you in the morning.